On the night of June 11, 1962, 3 men disappeared from the most heavily guarded federal prison in the United States. Their bodies were never found. Their whereabouts, even today, are officially unknown. 3 kilometers from the lights of San Francisco, in the center of the busiest bay on the west coast of the United States, a 12-hectare mass of sandstone rock emerges. The Spaniards christened it La Isla de los Alcatrazes, the Island of the Pelicans, in 1775, when Lieutenant Juan Manuel de Ayala sighted it covered with white birds during the first European expedition through the bay. The name derived from the Arabic al-Qadus, used by medieval alchemists to describe the recovery of precious substances from a vessel, an etymology that over time would prove ironic. The island passed from Spanish hands to Mexican ones, and from Mexican hands to American ones in 1848, without anyone feeling any particular urgency to inhabit it. Its topography made it inhospitable. Cliffs of up to 25 meters of vertical drop, underwater currents that Army engineers would discover were spindle-shaped, the result of centuries of clashes between tides. Around Alcatraz, the bay water rarely exceeds 15 degrees Celsius, and the currents can drag a swimmer toward the Pacific in a matter of minutes. The United States Army saw an advantage in that hostility. In 1859, for $1 million, it transformed the rock into the first fort and the first lighthouse on the west coast. It installed Columbiad's cannons from the War of 1812, capable of firing 50-kilo projectiles across the entrance to the bay. It laid coastal defense batteries. It dynamited the only gentle slope on the southeastern end, turning it into a cliff to eliminate any easy landing point. No enemy ever put those defenses to the test. By 1867, with no military mission to fulfill, the fort had begun to house military prisoners. For decades, Alcatraz functioned as a military prison, first for Confederate soldiers during the Civil War, then for Indian chiefs captured in the territories of Arizona and Alaska, later for deserters and common criminals of the Army. In 1906, when the earthquake destroyed the San Francisco jail, 176 civilian prisoners were temporarily transferred to the island. In the First World War, German spies and foreign enemies arrived. The place changed function, but not character. In 1909, the prisoners themselves built, on the foundations of the old military cisterns, the prison building that still stands today, a 3-story concrete and steel building with 4 cell blocks. The official cost was $250,000 plus $191,498 in inmate labor. The turning point came in 1933. The era of prohibition had engendered a new category of criminal, organized gangsters, armed, omnipresent in the media, Dillingers, Kellys, Kalangas of crime. Public opinion demanded a solution, and the Department of Justice responded with a simple and brutal idea. An island surrounded by icy water and deadly currents turned into the most extreme maximum security prison in American history. The War Department transferred Alcatraz to the Department of Justice in August 1934. Attorney General Homer Cummings entrusted the transformation to James A. Johnston, a banker and civic leader from San Francisco with prior experience as director of the state prisons of Folsom and San Quentin, where he had earned a reputation as a humanitarian reformer. Johnston designed a control system that his contemporaries described as a masterpiece of prison engineering. He replaced the soft iron bars of most of the building's cells and windows with tool-proof steel, with hardened alloy cable cores capable of resisting the most persistent saw or file. He installed automatic locking devices and tear gas outlets. He built galleries for armed guards at both ends of the cell block, an exterior walkway along the dining hall windows and steel doors in the utility corridors between the blocks. He erected watchtowers at the corners, connected by walkways. He fenced the entire perimeter with a metal fence topped with barbed wire. He installed bars in the sewers. He established a 200-meter exclusion zone around the island marked with orange buoys. And he designed the most singular system in the entire facility, the armorer. The armorer was the officer who, on each shift, controlled the interior of the prison from a vault inaccessible from inside, sealed on the interior side by steel plates perforated with weapon slits and a narrow panel of bulletproof glass. Only he could open the doors that led to the cell block, and he did so by consulting angled mirrors that allowed him to verify that no prisoner was using a guard as a shield. In the event of a disturbance, he pressed the siren to call off-duty personnel and distributed from his arsenal rifles, pistols, submachine guns, gas grenades, and ammunition. The system required 12 official prisoner counts per day, with 30 additional special counts. Hidden microphones transmitted sounds to the armorer's post without interruption. If any telephone was off the hook for more than 15 seconds, a bulb lit up on his panel and he dispatched an officer to investigate. The ratio of guards to prisoners was 1 to 3, compared with the usual 1 to 10 in other federal prisons. The guards were hand-picked from among the best in other penitentiaries, elite marksmen, trained in judo and in handling emergency situations. Anyone entering or leaving the island, from an inmate's mother to the Attorney General, had to pass through metal detectors. At the dock, before boarding the bus that went to the top, visitors emptied their pockets of coins, keys, and pens. If they wore glasses, they had to take them off. They passed twice through the detector arch while an officer watched an oscilloscope for an oscillating green line or listened for the deafening buzz that signaled the presence of metal. On August 18, 1934, before newsreel cameras, Johnston told Attorney General Cummings on the entrance steps, "Mr. Attorney General, Alcatraz is ready." And the press took note. The first shipment arrived that same midnight from Atlanta. A special train composed of a baggage car, a dining car, sleeping cars, and 2 cars with barred windows silently backed into the yard of the federal penitentiary. The 53 chosen men were taken from their cells one by one, led to the visiting room, stripped of their clothes, subjected to a body cavity search, dressed in pants without belts and heelless slippers, handcuffed to a chain anchored to the waist, shackled by the ankles, and boarded. The train departed before dawn on a secret journey westward. Guards patrolled the corridors, others handled machine guns in the vestibules. Upon arriving at Benicia in the Carquinez Strait, the 2 prisoner cars were placed on a barge and towed under Coast Guard escort to the island. Johnston telegraphed Washington, 53 boxes of furniture from Atlanta received in good condition, installed, no breakage. Among those boxes were names that had filled front pages for years. Al Capone, the Chicago boss whose empire had generated an estimated $20 million at its peak, arrived from Atlanta, where he had enjoyed special food, cigars, radio, and visits from his men. In Alcatraz, he found laundry work, which Johnston interrupted when the soldiers began writing to their families boasting that Capone washed their clothes. He reassigned him to scrubbing showers and toilets. The rule of silence, which prohibited any conversation not strictly necessary, was Capone's particular torture, a man for whom talking was an involuntary reflex. 10 days in the dungeon for speaking when entering the dining hall, another 10 for commenting on his punishment when leaving. 19 days for trying to bribe a guard with information about sporting events, which was all he wanted to know about the outside world. The attacks began soon. Harmon Whaley, a lanky kidnapper with mischievous eyes, brought the saxophone down on his head during a rehearsal of the small basement orchestra, knocking him off the stool next to his $1,500 banjo. J.P. Chase, Babyface Nelson's lieutenant, tried to kill him with an iron counterweight while another prisoner distracted the guard, and only the intervention of Roy Gardner, the most respected train robber in the block, deflected the blow. Capone's money, useless inside the prison, became a source of resentment. Other inmates asked him to pay their court appeals, and when he refused on the director's instruction, some considered it an excuse. After years of dungeons, beatings, and the silent torture of routine, Capone began to deteriorate. He refused to leave his cell, crouched in the corners with his eyes fixed on the void, sang Italian arias in the middle of the night. They confined him in the infirmary. His wife May visited him once he had a lucid day. The Department of Justice issued a statement speaking of mental disturbances and suggesting syphilitic paresis as a diagnosis. In January 1939, 7 months before completing his sentence, he was secretly transferred to another federal facility. He died in 1947 at the age of 48. Machine Gun Kelly, whose name sounded like an action movie, settled without fuss into the routine of the island. He was an accountant in the workshop store. A former guard described him decades later as tall, well-built, somewhat grey-haired, with a distinguished bearing like a banker. He searched for the 3-cent account for hours. Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, was another emblematic case. He had spent decades in Leavenworth studying avian diseases and publishing ornithology books, with his canary birds as constant company. In 1942, at midnight, while the country was focused on the Second World War, he was taken from his cell without prior warning, separated from his birds and his laboratory, and quietly shipped to Alcatraz. Director Bennett admitted years later that the transfer was because Stroud was a nuisance, not a danger. It was not the only case of that kind. The official history of Alcatraz presented it as a repository for the nation's most dangerous and incorrigible criminals. The documented reality was more complex. One man was serving time in Alcatraz for stealing a pig on an Indian reservation, a federal crime by territorial jurisdiction. Another for stealing 2 boxes of cigarettes from a train car in Oklahoma. A military prisoner, whose only offense had been deserting and voluntarily turning himself in afterward, ended up in Alcatraz when his name was drawn at random from a list during a hunger strike in Leavenworth in 1958. Earl Taylor, an accountant sentenced to 5 years for tax evasion, was released unconditionally directly from Alcatraz 5 minutes before he was due to appear before a court to argue his habeas corpus. Alan Clayton West, who played a central role in the most famous escape in the island's history, was serving 10 years for automobile theft. The operating cost of Alcatraz in 1962 was $13.79 per prisoner per day, compared with $5.37 on average in other federal prisons. In 1953, the Republican senator from North Dakota, William Langer, calculated before the Senate that the island cost approximately $5 million a year for a population of 150 prisoners, which equaled $33,000 annually per inmate, slightly more than it would cost to house them at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. From the first day a convict set foot on the Alcatraz dock, according to the guards, his only thought was how to get out. The labyrinth of steel doors, the metal detectors, the multitude of guards, the solidity of walls and bars, the crushing security of the cell, all of that added up for the newcomer to a desperate question: how the hell can anyone get out of here? 14 men attempted it before 1962 in several groups. 5 died after being hit by gunfire. 2, Ralph Rowe and Ted Cole, disappeared on December 16, 1937, during a storm that reduced visibility to 0, taking advantage of their shift in the glove workshop. They broke a metal grill window, slid down the side of the cliff toward the water, and were never seen again. The authorities declared that they had probably drowned, dragged by the currents toward the Pacific, but their bodies never appeared either. The most violent attempt was the Battle of Alcatraz in May 1946. 6 prisoners managed to get hold of the keys to the rifle gallery and took temporary control of the security section. They wounded 8 guards. The army sent Marines with grenades and assault rifles. After 3 days of fighting inside the cell block, 2 inmates died and 3 were later executed in the San Quentin gas chamber. In September 1958, Clyde Johnson and Aaron Burgett waited for an unusual dense fog to cover the island during their shift on the garbage detail. They pointed a knife at the face of the guard Harold Miller, tied and gagged him, dragged him to some bushes and ran toward the shore with the equipment they had hidden weeks in advance. 4 hours later, the guards found Johnson half a meter deep in the water, his teeth chattering. Of Burgett, nothing. 13 days later, his body appeared floating 100 meters from the southeastern end of the island. He was wearing all the escape equipment he had patiently manufactured over months, including wooden fins glued to the soles of his shoes with black adhesive tape, pants waterproofed also with tape, an improvised water wing made from the sleeve of a black raincoat, and a bag of domino pieces filled with wire, safety pins, and 2 small stones whose function was never clear. The weight of the soaked equipment probably sank him. Burgett was the 18th to attempt it. The official conclusion was always the same. The currents and the cold made the swim practically impossible. The water between Alcatraz and the shore of San Francisco, less than 2 kilometers away, ranged between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius. A person without thermal protection lost fine motor skills in the fingers in less than 10 minutes and could suffer incapacitating hypothermia in 20. Official propaganda insisted Alcatraz was impregnable. On January 14, 1960, a Thursday, the worst winter storm in years struck San Francisco Bay. Hail, gusting winds, lightning, a blackout in several communities on the Marine coast. The prison boat, the Warden Johnston, arrived half an hour late. It was waiting for a special passenger coming from Georgia. The man who boarded at the Fort Mason dock was 33 years old, of average height and build, hazel eyes with a direct and firm gaze, brown hair still damp from the rain. The only striking feature of his face was something he did not have. Not a single smile wrinkle at the corners of his mouth. The handcuffs connected him to a chain anchored to his waist. Iron shackles chained his feet. Frank Lee Morris was born on September 1, 1926, in Washington, D.C., the son of Clara, a woman who was 11 years old when she first ran away from her middle-class home and was returned by the police, and who spent her teenage years escaping from reformatories and foster homes, each time with more resources and fewer scruples. When Frank was weeks old, Clara was institutionalized again, and the baby placed in a foster home. The boy did not see his mot. Her again in any meaningful way after the age of 7. At 11, when he asked his foster family why he never received visits, they gently explained that his parents had died. Frank said he would stay praying for them. Not long after that conversation, he followed the same path as his mother. At 14, he went out the window at night with the loot from a neighborhood robbery, 2 diamond rings, a woman's watch, and some money. At 16, he already had a criminal record in several states. At 18, he had already been in 2 reformatories. At 30, he had been confined in Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, and other states, always with the same pattern: theft, escape, capture, theft, escape. The FBI record described him with a precision that, over time, would become prophetic, above all, a planner. In April 1955, while serving time at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, Morris and a companion disappeared during a sugarcane cutting workday. The tracking dogs followed their trail to the ditch of a rural road where a farmer had picked them up as hitchhikers. In New Orleans, Morris spent months reconnoitering a bank in Slidell on the other side of Lake Pontchartrain. On Thanksgiving night of that year, he and 2 accomplices drilled through the back wall of the bank, opened 2 safes with a torch, and extracted $6,165 entirely in coins. A month and a half later, the FBI found them in a motel southwest of Baton Rouge. Morris was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. He had enough prior convictions to justify his transfer to the harshest prison in the system. The day Morris crossed the 3 steel doors of the cell block and found the plaque with his name on the door of cell 138 on the 2nd floor of Block C, what he saw was a room 1.5 meters wide by 2.5 meters long, rear wall of concrete, side walls of sheet steel, front of bars. On the right, a cot that folded against the wall. At the back, a toilet without lid or seat. Opposite, 2 folding steel shelves for table and chair. On the left, a sink with a single cold water faucet. Above the sink, 2 wooden shelves for personal effects and pegs for hanging clothes. And to the right of the sink, near the floor of the rear wall, a metal ventilation grill about 15 centimeters by 25. Morris saw it. According to the guards, it was the first thing any new prisoner always saw. In the autumn of 1961, one night after lights out, Morris was cutting his nails. The nail clipper had 2 articulated arms. The longer one, with a sharp tip, served as a lever for the blades. The shorter one carried a file and a metal point for cleaning under the nails. Morris closed the nail clipper, tossed it into the air distractedly, and caught it. His eyes fell on the ventilation grill. He stood up. He looked at the corridor. He quickly went to the rear wall and knelt down. He used the tip of the nail cleaner to scratch the concrete around the metal frame. Nothing at first. He tried harder. A few grains fell. He tried the opposite edge. More fragments. A few minutes later, he had concrete splinters accumulated in the palm of his hand. He stood up, trembling. The concrete of the walls, built in 1909, was 52 years old. The saltpeter from the bay had slowly degraded it for more than half a century. It was not fresh, high-strength concrete. It was a mixture of concrete, mortar, and plaster that, while still seeming solid, yielded to a metal instrument handled with patience. Morris took weeks to plan each step. First, he needed a way to hide the work. When Alan West, his neighboring cellmate, came out of isolation in early 1962, Morris ordered him to buy an accordion exactly like his. The instrument case would perfectly cover the grill. Then he summoned the Anglin brothers. Clarence and John Anglin from Georgia were brothers and had committed several bank robberies together. Clarence, with a history of 4 previous escape attempts, had exceptional manual skill. John worked in the prison clothing room. Morris needed them both. Without the Anglins' coverage as lookouts and suppliers of materials, the plan was unfeasible. At the dining room table, Morris explained the plan in the fewest words possible. First, the 4 of them would request as many magazines as possible from the library, cut out the pages with advertising on both sides, soak them and knead them to obtain papier-mâché cardboard. With that cardboard, they would make replicas of the ventilation grills, painted exactly so they would withstand a casual inspection. Behind the replicas, each one would silently bore through the concrete of his wall for months, until breaking through it. The utility corridor that ran behind the cells gave access to a pipe that could be climbed to the top of the block. From there, a ventilation duct led to the roof, from the roof to the water. The primary excavation tool was the nail clipper. Morris improved it with a brazing process that he carried out in his own cell. He scraped a dime until he obtained a small amount of powdered silver, made a cone of matches with conical precision to concentrate the heat at the exact point, and joined the blade of the nail clipper to the handle of a metal spoon stolen from the dining hall. The concentrated flame melted the silver, which acted as solder. The resulting tool was more efficient and allowed a firmer grip. Every night after lights out, Morris removed the accordion case, spread his folded peacoat on the floor to muffle the noise of the fragments as they fell, and knelt before the grill. He chipped for an hour, sometimes more, keeping the fragments in his pockets to scatter them the next day on the way to the workshops. He collected the dust in the sink, moistened it with a piece of paper, and used it to cover the visible cuts. When finished, he reinstalled the grill, cleaned all evidence with a damp corner of the blue handkerchief provided to him by regulation, and returned to the front of the cell. When the grill gave way weeks later, Morris inserted a broomstick turned in the workshop as a wedge. A guard stopped him one day at the checkpoint. "What is that wedge for?" Morris explained that it was a clothes hanger that fit better vertically, an idea taken from a magazine. The guard let him pass. Behind the grill, the wall was about 20 centimeters thick. Once through it, the utility corridor was a narrow, dark passage with saltwater pipes, ladders, and an atmosphere that a veteran guard described as that of a freighter about to be scrapped. Morris was the first to crawl to the back and climb the pipe to the top of the block. There he found the ventilation duct that went up to the roof. 2 metal bars protected the passage, and a rain cap with 6 bolts closed the exit. They needed a drill, and they needed Clarence Anglin to give him upward momentum from his shoulders. The motor of a small music room fan was replaced by a workshop drill bit, which Morris inserted into the accordion case by slightly crushing the instrument. When he plugged it into the electrical outlet of the duct, wrapped in raincoats to muffle the sound, he found that it did not have enough power to drill metal. The solution came from Clarence. 6 miserable rivet heads are not going to stop us. They filed them by hand for weeks, using a banjo string and a fragment of carborundum cord that a mechanic from the workshop obtained for them. A pocket flashlight stolen from a guard's pocket allowed them to work in the duct without turning on lights that could attract attention. Morris made 6 balls of soap painted black to visually replace the rivet heads once removed, in case a guard looked through the duct from the roof. The mannequins were the most elaborate detail. Morris molded heads with a mixture of plaster made from fragments of concrete from the utility corridor, soap and white glue from the workshop. He sculpted them with his fingers and the handle of the spoon. He painted the flesh with an experimental mixture of pink, white, and black until obtaining the particular pallor of the Alcatraz prisoners. He glued eyebrows and hair with fibers obtained from Clarence, who acted as barber. He even added eyelashes. Morris looked at himself in the mirror of his cell while he worked. He was his own model. The mannequins were kept during the day in the utility corridor and placed in the beds after lights out. John Anglin, who worked in the clothing room, stole black plastic raincoats for weeks. He wore them up from the basement every afternoon. A guard stopped him one day upon seeing that he always wore the same raincoat and asked him if he was not cold. John explained that he was from the south and that the island was not Florida. The guard suggested that he request a peacoat. John said they had run out. The guard nodded. John limited his loot to 1 per day. With 55 raincoats, Morris and Clarence built 2 rafts, sealing the edges with liquid plastic to make them watertight, and made life preservers using inflated sleeves tied at both ends as a bandolier, which, according to an article in the magazine Popular Mechanics that Morris had requested from the library, offered approximately 70% buoyancy. He also carved 2 plywood oars in the workshop. By Monday, June 11, 1962, the conspiracy had been active for 18 months. All the holes were drilled. The mannequins were ready. The raft and life preservers were stored in the wire mesh cage at the top of the block, where they had turned the space into an invisible workshop. But that Monday was not the agreed date. Morris had set the escape for the following Monday. He had asked for more time to study the tide charts in the library and reconnoiter the route to the beach beside the power plant. The Anglins arrived that night at the utility corridor with the mannequins under their arms without prior notice. "We cannot wait any longer. We go tonight." West, who that afternoon had sealed his hole with a mixture of cement stolen from construction sacks in the utility corridor, discovered that he could not reopen it in time. While the other 3 climbed the pipe toward the top of the block, West frantically chipped at the set cement, stopping every time he heard the guard's footsteps to get into bed and pretend to be asleep. Shortly before 10 at night, the cell block guards made the final count before definitively turning off the lights. The guard who passed in front of Morris's and the Anglins' cells saw 3 motionless figures in the beds, with dark hair showing above the sheets. He went on. On the roof, Morris led the march. They had left the ventilation duct cautiously, removing the rain cap with its 6 supports precisely to avoid noise. A gust of wind snatched it from Morris's hands and made it clatter on the concrete. The 3 froze in the duct for several minutes, waiting for the siren. It did not sound. The floor guard who had heard the noise went to inform the lieutenant on duty. The lieutenant went up to the infirmary on the 3rd floor, found nothing, and concluded that someone had thrown a bucket. He returned to his post. The fog that night was high, about 100 meters, enough to see but not so close to the water as to become disoriented. The ebb tide at its peak was running at 2.2 knots, slightly more than 4 kilometers per hour, favorable for crossing toward Angel Island. The water temperature was around 13 degrees. Morris studied the sky for a moment and assessed the watchtowers. The northern one could see them if they remained standing. The southern one illuminated the kitchen wall with spotlights, the only descent route from the dining hall roof. Morris tied the rolled raft to his belt on the left side. With his face turned to reduce the reflection, he descended the kitchen ventilation pipe with slow and uniform movements, pressed to the side opposite the tower until touching the ground. He dropped face down and crawled toward the shadows. The Anglins descended in the same way. From there, they crawled to the metal fence, climbed it, got over the barbed wire and descended on the other side. They circled the base of the water tank and slid down the slope covered with fern plant toward the coast. A patrol guard passed along the path, 3 meters from them. They flattened themselves against the ground. The guard continued toward the workshops. They ran under cover of the power plant outside the angle of vision of the towers and reached a small cove on the rocky shore. The lights of the Golden Gate Bridge flickered under the fog to the west. Morris rolled out the raft. Clarence forced air into the sleeves of the life preservers, inflating them on the fly and knotting them. John remembered that he had left an oar behind. "Forget it," Morris said. They got onto the raft at the shore, pushed off with the only oar, and merged with the darkness of the bay in the direction of Angel Island, 2.5 kilometers away. Behind them, in his cell, West chipped at the cement in desperation. At midnight, he managed to open the hole and climb. In the workshop at the top of the block, he found an unfinished raft, a plywood oar, and 3 life preservers. His own mannequin looked at him from the floor with painted eyes. He leaned into the ventilation duct. The cold hit him. Around him, only the moan of the wind. He decided to descend. When he stuck his head out through the duct to look at the roof, a colony of seagulls sleeping on the parapets took flight, screaming. West got back into the duct in tenths of a second, went down, crossed the utility corridor, entered his cell and lay down on the bed, exhausted. The guard in the south tower saw the commotion of the seagulls and called the armorer, who sent 2 guards to walk the exterior perimeter. They reported, "Nothing, probably a rat scared them." The seagulls calmed down. The night remained calm until 7 in the morning on June 12th, when the guard on duty made the morning count and put his hand through the bars to shake Morris's shoulder and ask him to get up for breakfast. The painted plaster head rolled across the bed. The Alcatraz siren howled at 7:30 in the morning. The FBI, the Army, the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the San Francisco police began a massive search operation. Soldiers from the Presidio of San Francisco with carbines combed Angel Island inch by inch. Helicopters flew over the bay. Coast Guard boats searched the water in grids for days. Every robbery and every burglary in Northern California during the following weeks was carefully reviewed for clues that could be attributed to the fugitives, who would undoubtedly need clothing, food, and money once outside. On Wednesday, 2 days after the escape, a plywood oar appeared floating 200 meters from Alcatraz toward the Marin coast. On Thursday afternoon, a dredging boat of the Army Corps of Engineers operating off Angel Island brought onto deck, along with other trash collected with the search net, a black plastic bag. They were actually 2 bags, one inside the other, conscientiously waterproofed, made from the same material as the prison raincoats. Inside, dry, was Clarence Anglin's travel wallet, about 60 photographs, mostly family snapshots, including 15 images of a young brunette woman, a list of names and addresses, and the receipt for a $10 money order cashed by the Alcatraz postal clerk in the name of Clarence Anglin. The prison authorities interpreted the find as proof of drowning. The bag, they argued, would have come out of the overturned raft. If the 3 had died in the water, their personal effects would float. It was an understandable but incomplete logic. It could also mean that the bag was deliberately abandoned to create that impression, or simply that it fell into the water during the crossing without the raft overturning. The director of the Bureau of Prisons, James Bennett, and the deputy director, Fred Wilkinson, flew to San Francisco to give a press conference. Wilkinson explained that Alcatraz was in a weakened state, as if the problem were the age of the building and not supervisory negligence. Blackwell, the prison warden, admitted that the inmates had been working at least 6 months. He added that the concrete did not crumble to the touch, but that there was some erosion. He said the mannequins were realistic. He said the guards made hourly night counts. None of them remembered when they had last inspected the cells of the fugitives. The answer to that specific question never came. Journalists were not allowed into the cell block. It was argued that there was some unrest among the remaining prisoners. They were only able to photograph, from no less than 2.5 meters away, a cot with a mannequin expressly placed in the visiting room. Warden Blackwell handed out color photographs of the cells with the holes. It was precisely that distribution of materials that revealed West's role. A journalist from the San Francisco Chronicle, Charles Rodebor, noticed that one of the photos showed a 4th cell with a hole and an annotation on the back, a C. West's cell. He called the warden by telephone. Blackwell replied, "Oh, I would prefer that you not publish that." The next day it was in every newspaper. Wilkinson announced before the press that his investigation had detected no indication of deliberate negligence. 3 days later, with no further public statements on the matter, the guards who had been on duty the night of the escape were suspended for 20 days without pay for failing to make accurate counts. When journalists asked for the names of the guards, Blackwell said that was a personal matter, not public. 5 months later, the deputy director who had concluded that there had been no negligence was promoted to director of another federal institution with public praise from Bennett. West, who had stayed behind and remained on the island, was exhaustively interrogated by the FB1. He confirmed every detail of the conspiracy, but claimed not to know where Morris and the Anglins were headed or whether they had contacts on the outside who could provide them with documents or money. Since legally he had not escaped, the federal prosecutor's office considered that prosecuting a man who literally did not manage to leave the prison would produce unpredictable results before a jury. They let it be. West's report was classified in the Department of Justice for decades, and it was only possible to learn the details of the conspiracy in 1962 through confidential sources that journalist J. Campbell Bruce took months to cultivate. 6 months after Morris's escape, on December 16, 1962, exactly 25 years after Rowe and Cole carried out the first disappearance without a trace in the island's history, John Paul Scott and Darl Lee Parker fled by cutting a window bar in a storeroom under the kitchen using, according to Scott himself, Ordinary rope rubbed with sink cleaner as an abrasive, although experts later calculated that this method would have required 75 years of full-time work to cut 1 centimeter of steel. They probably used banjo strings and a spatula with serrated edges. They lowered themselves down the north facade of the building using a 50-foot extension cord torn from floor polishers. Parker was found on a rocky islet 100 meters from the island, numb with cold and without strength. Scott reached dry land at Fort Point, just inside the Golden Gate, almost 3 kilometers from Alcatraz, in a state of advanced hypothermia with a body temperature of 34 degrees, and was found by teenagers who called the military police. He was the first prisoner in the history of Alcatraz whose arrival on dry land was confirmed. He wore inflated surgical gloves tucked into the sleeves of a jacket tied around his waist as a float. Bennett flew to San Francisco again for another press conference, this time in a bankruptcy courtroom downtown, the largest room available. 90 minutes of questions and answers in which the director several times had to answer, "I do not know, perhaps the warden knows," while Warden Blackwell, standing beside him, chain-smoked cigarettes and remained silent. The investigation revealed that another prisoner had begun cutting the same bar a year before Scott, and that Scott simply resumed the work where the other one left it when he was transferred. The bar was never detected by the periodic inspections. In March 1963, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy announced the closure of Alcatraz for economic reasons. On March 21st, the last prisoners left in handcuffs while television cameras recorded. The next day, the island was empty. It was, as Warden Blackwell observed in December 1962 with involuntary irony, that apparently we were not hurrying enough to close. Since 1962, the FB1 officially kept the case open for 17 years. In 1979, it closed it, declaring that, in the absence of evidence of survival, the 3 had probably drowned. In 2013, 51 years after the escape, the case was transferred to the U.S. Marshals Service, which keeps it active because the statute of limitations for the federal escape offense does not run while the subjects are alive. That detail is significant. The argument most often invoked against survival is the cold and the currents. On the night of June 11th, the water temperature was around 13 degrees Celsius. Without a wetsuit, an active person in water at that temperature begins to lose physical performance in the first 10 minutes. In 20, hypothermia seriously affects movement coordination. In 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the person's physical build and level of activity, unconsciousness may occur. Angel Island, the most likely destination, is about 2.5 kilometers away. At a sustained rowing pace, that distance requires between 45 minutes and 1 hour and 20, depending on the currents. The margin is narrow, however. Morris and the Anglins had spent months deliberately showering with cold water to condition the cardiovascular system to the cold. The plastic raincoats, in addition to serving as construction material for the raft, offered some thermal protection by covering most of the body. They were equipped with several inflated sleeve life preservers that kept the head above water even if they lost consciousness. And the tide on that specific night at 2.2 knots was significantly lower than average. Currents above 4 knots are the ones that have historically proven lethal for those who attempted the swim. The strongest argument in favor of survival is the absence of bodies. When Aaron Burgett drowned in 1958, his corpse appeared 13 days later, 100 meters from the southeastern end of the island, perfectly identifiable despite advanced decomposition. The documented pattern for bodies in San Francisco Bay at that time of year ranged between 10 and 14 days, depending on water temperature conditions and crustacean activity on the bottoms. If the 3 had died in the water on the night of June 11th to 12th, it would have been expected that at least one of the bodies would surface during the following 2 weeks within the active search perimeter. None did. In 2013, independent researcher Dirk Ballard, a specialist in oceanography, carried out computer modeling of the currents of San Francisco Bay on the night of June 11, 1962, using historical tide data recorded by NOAA. His simulations indicated that a raft departing from the northwestern shore of Alcatraz, the most likely direction given West's account of the descent route, would have reached Angel Island or the Marin coast in a time of between 2 and 4 hours, depending on rowing intensity. The simulations also showed that a departure in the interval between 10 at night and midnight offered the most favorable tidal conditions of that entire night. In 2015, the Anglin family presented the FBI with several photographs supposedly taken in 1975 in Brazil that showed two men about 45 years old with facial features consistent with those of Clarence and John Anglin. The FBI analyzed the images using facial recognition software and declared them inconclusive, neither authentic nor false beyond all reasonable doubt. The original metadata of the photographs could not be verified. In 2018, the U.S. Marshals Service announced that it had received a letter supposedly written by John Anglin, with no specific mailing date but with references suggesting it had been written around 2013. The letter stated that the three had survived the crossing of the bay, that Frank Morris had died in 2008, that Clarence had died in 2011, and that John himself was still alive but had cancer and was willing to turn himself in exchange for medical care and a reduction of his sentence to 1 year. The letter was never authenticated. There was no surrender. The authorities did not rule out that it was false, but they did not manage to prove it either. In 2020, a team of Dutch researchers published in the journal PLOS-1 a statistical and modeling analysis that simulated multiple escape scenarios for the night of June 11, 1962, crossing variables of tide, temperature, estimated rowing speed, and direction. The conclusions indicated that if the three fugitives had departed between 11 at night and midnight and maintained a north-northwest direction toward the Golden Gate Bridge, they would have had real chances of reaching the Marine Coast or the northern end of the San Francisco Peninsula. The researchers emphasized that the night of June 11, 1962, had tidal conditions significantly more favorable than the historical average for that time of year, which makes that specific date a more relevant variable than had been considered until then. None of these investigations has produced a definitive conclusion. The truth about what happened after the raft moved away from the cove under the Alcatraz power plant in the early morning of June 12, 1962, remains unestablished with certainty. Alcatraz closed on March 21, 1963. The cost of maintaining the island, the logistics of transporting drinking water by boat from the mainland, and the accelerated deterioration of the structures due to the saline humidity of the Pacific had turned it into an unsustainable financial problem. The escape of Morris and the Anglins accelerated the political decision. If three men with spoons stolen from the dining hall could get through its walls by digging silently for 18 months, the symbolic argument of impregnability had definitively evaporated. The island later experienced other equally singular chapters. In November 1969, a group of activists from the organization Indians of All Tribes took possession of the island based on an 1868 treaty that, according to their interpretation, granted the Sioux the right to claim abandoned federal lands. The occupation lasted 19 months and ended in June 1971 when the federal government cut off electricity, water, and communications. During that time, the number of occupants fluctuated between several hundred at the peak moments and a few dozen in the final stretch. The warden's house and other structures were set on fire, which the government allowed to happen as a way of managing the eviction without direct confrontation. In 1972, Congress incorporated Alcatraz into the Golden Gate National Recreation Area under the management of the National Park Service. Since 1973, the island has been open to the public. More than 1.5 million visitors tour it each year, making it one of the most visited tourist destinations in California. The cell block can be toured with an audio guide that reproduces the voices of former guards and former inmates. Cells 138, 140, and 152 on the second floor of Block C still have the holes visible behind where the accordion cases were placed. In museum display cases, replicas of the ventilation grills made of papier-mâché, the restored original mannequins, and homemade tools similar to those used by Morris are exhibited. The FBI file on Frank Lee Morris, number 76-26199, has more than 6,000 pages. The last entries are from 1979, the year the Bureau declared the case officially closed with the conclusion of probable death by drowning. The U.S. Marshals Service file, opened in 2013, remains active. The service has not established a closing date.